Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to another episode of the Grid Mod Pod. I'm, as I am with every episode, excited for our guest, but this is an introduction that we made in one of our AEIC Center for Operational Excellence Critical Action Forum workshops, where I've gotten to meet Aaron, who's our telecom leader at Arizona Public Service. I'll let him introduce himself. But today we just really wanted to kind of break down some of the fundamentals around telecom and really talk about the role that your expertise and your journey has in the full scheme of grid modernization. So with that, Aaron, I'm going to throw it over to you to introduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and appreciate the time here. Aaron Dudney here. Work for Arizona Public Service, public utility in the state of Arizona. I've been in the industry here with them for about 24 years. Prior to that, I was IT in the military, so I've got a fair amount of experience in the industry from a telecom perspective. I'm a senior manager, and on that side, I'm mostly on the OT side. So we have the comm engineering, comm maintenance, comm integration, and then I have a little bit of the IP network side as well, the network engineers. And so they kind of bridge both OT and IT in that space.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a few questions on that before I launch. Just, a big part of grid modernization and the journey that I've been on since really reading the grid modernization roadmap that the DOE put together, I think like 2015. But I found it in my career in 2017, 2018. And a part of that language is like the physical infrastructure is kind of like your foundational needs have to be assessed and implemented and improved. And we're in the space of aged infrastructure as well as preparing for the future. But the next layer was telecom and telecommunications, and then IT and OT. And so you said IT and OT, and I was just going to put you on the spot. There is this essence that they are one or could be one, but fundamentally they are two. It's just a world that we're living in that I think they have to realize who they are to each other. So just a little bit for our listeners, like what's that? And you kind of spelled it out, but you have your IT that understands, and then you have your OT that like you kind of oversee.
Well, I think, from where I stand, I look at the OT as we're governed by different bodies than the IT side of the business. Transport is transmitter, no matter how you cut it out. But we are governed differently. So when on my OT side, they're ensuring that our grid operations maintain to secure and are able to control that environment. And so we fall under the NERC and FERC and the WAC regulatory governing bodies. Whereas on the IT side, we have a different audience that governs that. But transport, it's going to be the same, right? Same equipment, just looked at differently.
Exactly. And so that's so beautiful that you said that. So I was just at another workshop about electrification of all of our devices. But what I think the power of those workshops is bringing in the internal utility stakeholders that are all actively pursuing the same goal, which is to serve all customers safely, reliably, affordable. But everyone has unique perspectives, like even around the language. So like you just said, it's the same transport, right? The same functions, but like the perspective of what it's needed to do and how it needs to be done and whose authority is over what is different. And that in itself causes friction. Okay. So as these utilities, all of us, and how is telecom infrastructure, in your opinion, keeping pace, considering the age and really that fragmentation of these existing networks that, we currently sit with?
How are we keeping pace? One could argue, are we keeping pace? Because really the infrastructure is not something that you can spend on a dime because there's a lot to it, right? You're talking about, a lot of times you're talking about the transport microwave infrastructure. You're talking about the fiber optics infrastructure. You're talking about, you're covering miles and miles of territory by some form of transport. And it's not something that you can do, switch out overnight and then align to the business's either current or future wants and technologies. right? So you've got this old legacy communication, TDM, time division multiplex that is, throughout the environment. And we want to move to more of an IP-based routable protocol that's more dynamic and offers a lot of good features. But you just can't plop a radio in there and let it start talking to these end devices without a significant major uplift in the environment. We're going through that now with our legacy microwaves, right? The old point to point, if you will, the Alcatel radios to the Nokia system. And it's it's turning into probably an 11-year lift to get where we need to be statewide. And it's big, it's huge, and it's nonstop, right? And there's the local area network piece of it, there's the wide area, there's the radio piece. There's a lot of components here that have to be in play in order to maintain that fluid communications between the end device and then the control centers, if you will.
Right. And I think, we spent a lot of time on the grid modernization pod, and really a lot of the language that is shared externally, a lot of documentation, a lot of the panels that we all get asked to talk to. We have to remember that telecom is physical infrastructure in itself. So not only do we need to think and talk more boldly about that physical asset, right? Like we talk about transmission towers, we talk about, with this increased exponential load demand with data centers and electrification of these new technologies, we're talking 10 times, it's probably more now with all the rush of data centers, 10 times more distribution grid than we have and 4 times more transmission. But with that, in parallel, comes this infrastructure that you kind of just broke down. It's like the microwave tires in themselves don't just appear overnight. And so if we're going from this point-to-point system, which you can correct me if I think I correctly, to this digital backbone, there's a lot. It can't be an afterthought, I guess is my point, right?
No.
So just thinking, especially for folks that have been avid listeners, and even myself, telecom's becoming a new passion of mine. There's a lot of buzz around private LTE, 5G, expanding fiber, right? So those are other work streams. So you just spoke of this 11-year plan. Break that down. You're not actually working on those things. You're actually working on overhauling the existing backbone, or maybe you're doing a blow.
We've got several lanes that we're working in, right? One is actually rebuilding the infrastructure from a microwave radio backhaul perspective. Right. So getting off the old legacy point-to-point communications to this more dynamic routing protocol type of environment, and building the interfaces that allow us to continue to talk to the legacy RTUs that are still out there that are not yet IP capable. So that's going to be another. What's that?
Breakdown or acronym.
Well, RT is a remote terminal unit that's out on the edge device that's usually either for control or monitoring or backhaul data for the electrical utility side of the business.
Right. And so for anyone trying to visualize the grid, you have the substations with all those devices that kind of open close based on pulses of your various voltage and current. But to be able to receive that information broadly and to control it remotely, you have to have an RTU. So every breaker or switch, one could say, has this piece of device communicating, right?
Yeah.
Which is a lot.
Yeah, you're not going to talk. In the old days, you'd throw a troublesman or a serviceman out there, and they'd open manually a breaker and based upon the commands given by the energy control center or whatever distribution or whatever you're working with. Now it's becoming more automated, where not automated, I should say, automated, I guess would imply that it's on its own, whereas now we're providing a means for them to remotely access the grid. And the next iteration is likely going to be automated, where the grid is more self-healing.
And that's the digital backbone, right? Or
yeah, that's what?
I guess I don't know why I said digital backbone, but there has to be an upgrade in the current systems, or can microwave do that? But to have almost that near real-time response to dispatch.
Microwave, your microwave is your big pipe, right? Mountaintop to mountaintop, that's going to bridge your big gaps of transport, if you will. So if you can't put in fiber, you throw in the microwave, and then that's really everything shoots into the microwave and is backhauled to the data center. That's where all your data is going to be housed, or your control rooms. But the microwave itself is just that, it's transport. Now you add your MAS systems out there to control the grid, which is your multiple address systems that are going to allow you to get to the RTUs, right? So it's kind of a it's traveling down the highway, exiting, getting on a frontage road, getting down to the end device, right? Is basically in terms
Right.
of my people understand.
And there's and then there's I think we learned about in our workshop, that last mile. And so that's kind of where Wi-Fi maybe, and like the private, like
Cellular, there's Wi-Fi, they're talking LTE now, private LTE. We have like I said, the MAS, we have our own internal license spectrum that we run on for our multiple address systems. That's last mile. Then there's fiber. In some cases, we have copper. We have some lease services where it's some very remote, very out in the middle of nowhere, and there's just no reason to put a fiber. And maybe there's no cellular. So then, if there's copper available through one of the providers, and we'll jump on that and just backhaul a circuit, just typically for reading and monitoring, if you will.
I'm secretly geeking out here because there's so much that you're saying that like I want to create an analogy to what I understand is kind of the electron flow. But the more I think about it, the power grid and how my mother told me I'm not allowed to say create, which technically not. You don't create energy. You generate the electrical current. I mean, that is a law, right? You don't create or destroy energy. You can only transfer or transform. But when we're talking about telecom and communication, like that's even harder to like visualize the concepts of how you're taking everything from one source to the next. So I won't try to do it here, but
You know, Elizabeth, I'll tell you, it's like when I first started in the industry, it was very simple in my world. It was, the transport was there. It was point to point. It was deterministic routing. That's what I grew up with. And then the new generations they don't deal with that. They deal with dynamic routing. The protocols are different. Everything is a different world. So when we start talking about this other legacy comm, it's new to people. Yet it's one of the older technologies that the utilities are faced with trying to replace and upgrade.
so it's almost like, so let me repeat that. So when you first started the industry, it was point to point. So like you kind of like, it was very simplified to the terms it could be. And you understood it robustly and very well. And it's almost like telecom went through this transformational change, which we all kind of all know of, but we forget to talk about. So then the next generation workforce has learned on that and almost forgotten the fundamentals of the legacy, which is being taught for this transformation to happen, because they both have to be available to each. And something I've been saying for years is like the grid will exist as we transform to a new reality. So we can't just act as if one day the grid's like just going to disappear to meet these like new technologies. So it's almost like telecom has been going through that.
We're on this constant churn of the technology, the workforce, the skill set, and yet at the same time having to support all of it. Right. I mean, it's not easy. And this transition that we're in, and I think most utilities are facing this, is that we have this old legacy stuff out there we still have to maintain, and it's every bit as critical as the new stuff they're putting out there. And you just can't double your workforce because you got two different technologies. So you're taking and trying to educate people to be this new IP based type of skill set, yet at the same time understand Ohm's law, and get away from they walked into a newer environment and it's kind of in a way red, bad, green, good. They look at the red light, chuck it, pluck it, chuck it, put a new blade in, and they're good to go. Whereas in the old stuff, they're pulling out meters, they're testing levels, they're checking resistance. I mean, they're doing all the old legacy communication technician stuff. And the newer stuff just doesn't allow us to do that. It's all circuit board and solid state, right? I mean, there's nothing there to peel apart, and you don't get that. What is the component level of today's technology? A box at best.
Right. It's kind of like, I guess, all the mechanics that are going to be transforming into like these new electric vehicles. But I divert. So yeah, like it's easy, I think, for a lot of us to focus and heighten our attention on new technology. But thinking about like, we throw around the word reliability quite a bit. I think we can measure it from a grid perspective. Maybe we could debate that. But, resilience, right? So this idea of like, what is resiliency? It's understanding your risk of things. So like when the grid goes down, it's almost like a catch-22. The communication network is the same as the grid, and the grid is the same as the communication network. So in your experience, what do you think, and we might have mentioned it a little bit, but like, is the most overlooked risk? I mean, it might have been just what we spoke of, but in context to system reliability and like this evolving buzzword of future resiliency. Like, what do you think?
I mean, I don't know if it's the most risk, but I think the one thing that does keep me up is this. It's truly this transition period. We touched on it earlier. Is the old to the new, and they're just in this world of technicians, they have to know so much about so many different things, and we don't have the ability to say, okay, like for instance, I have folks spread throughout the state of Arizona, not unlike any other utility, but I mean, I've got in key locations, I've got technicians out there. And these technicians, I'm saying, I want you to work on the radios. I want you to work on the RTUs. Well, I like to transport the RTUs, the MASs, the MUX banks. I want you to be a fiber person too. I want you to learn about fiber. Oh, by the way, you got security. There's a physical layer there. You've got to work on like card readers and beam towers. No, and then two-way radios, right? You got to make sure you go on the trucks and work on those, and that the guys, they're walkie-talkies, the portable radios or handy talkies, whatever you want to call them, but they got to know how to work on those as well. Oh, and then now we just added a switch out there, so I need you to get your CCNA so that you're able to log in and troubleshoot and help be the eyes and ears of the corporate side that may touch that device and help distribute or ensure that our service centers is out there have communications. And then the telephones, don't forget the telephones, you got the telephones. And then make sure you got your climbing gear so that in case we have a problem with one of our dishes, you could go up there and check alignment.
I mean,
not to mention how you get there. If it's in the winter, you might have to use a snowcat or a snowmobile to get up there.
so like your telecom folk are kind of like the superheroes of
I like to think of them that way, but they certainly have their hands full as far as,
yeah. And,
what they're expected to know.
and I guess just from my experience and knowing some of the telecom folk that I've, had the pleasure to work with, like what you just broke down there was something I do quite a bit on the podcast, is talking about, the utility in itself from the operations side, right? There's, the moment the customer wants to connect, for the doers to really study and understand what that connection is going to look like, to then planning and forecasting the load, asset management, assessing all of the assets. I have a point here. Then you got your engineering design firm. Then you have your field operation folk that, we think about is, the substation crews. And then you have your linemen. And then you have like troubleshooters, right? And they all kind of have special. Oh, then you do have your telecom folk.
Yep.
And then you have your operators. And what you just thought out is like there's a telecom team within like the asset management realm, but within telecom is like a whole fleet of assets. And then on top of that, most of that expertise is actually the field employees. What'd you say? Maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the expertise is going to be spread across different layers of the OSI stack, if you will. What's happening is our world is being, as we go to this IP base, it comes with a lot more opportunities from a grid management, grid efficiency, grid availability environment, right? The old days of the TDM are, they serve us well, but we do need to move on. But through applications, applications are moving fast these days. AI is going to speed that up. And the application, way I see it, and the controls of the grid are really the cars and the trucks on the highway. They want me to make sure that the highway's ready. And we're moving as fast as we can, but as everybody witnesses, they go out there and they say, okay, well, I'm going to need X amount of money, X amount of billions to do this work. And they're looking at you like, what?
What? Like,
what is this money thing you're talking about? And it's a challenge that we all face with. So, you're balancing what's the priority. And then you got to kind of, we have to go into a more of a measurable, or I guess more of a strategic approach, right? So what's the most important factor of this network that we need to touch now to get the biggest bang for our buck? And Then we got to get alignment with the application team, who's moving a lot faster than we are. Then we got to get alignment with the business side, or I say the energy control side, to make sure we're not either outpacing them or that
Right.
we're ready for them to put their new stuff on. It's a balance,
That's a
and we have to work together, for sure.
massive project management use case.
Yep.
And so, and you mentioned, the best strategies will fall short. And so, and this is also another resonating theme for any of your listeners. Let me know if you agree. It's all about people, right? And knowing the people, having the trust in the people, having the skill set of the people to then execute a certain set of processes, which will make and create the evolution of any technology, right? So, I think, really turning to the human side, and we're kind of talking about a lot, but workforce wise, what skills or roles, and if you would just, let's say you're just someone's asking you, what is missing or what should we focus on, and I could answer for what I think you're going to say, but in managing and integrating all of these legacy systems with the new systems, and then that whole project management space that you just spoke of, right? Like understanding the gaps between what the IT need to know, what the OTs are up to, and then how to incorporate that into the field.
I think I don't think anybody argue with the fact that it's training. Training is going to be is where you're going to get the biggest buck, but it's not just throwing it out there and hoping it sticks. It's really having a mature and developed program that training it's really embedded in the DNA of the people working out there in the field. Because think about it, if I'm working, so for instance, as I'm going through this whole next generation network and building it out, and say for the northern folks, I build it out and we have training because it's new and everybody sits around and talks about what the Nokia does and all that. They learn. The guys in the southern part of the state may not see that for 3 or 4 years.
Right.
So they go, wait, we already gave you training. You should know this stuff. So it's not a one-time thing. It's this reinforcement and a training environment. I tell the people, I said, look, you gotta stay relevant. We're going to give you the tools. You got to train. You got to learn. You got to be curious about the technology, but you have to stay relevant. If you're not curious, we're going to struggle. And so it starts here to really emphasize the importance of, how do you stay relevant in the industry? And I just harp on that so much with my teams. It's like, you got to stay with it, guys, because I can only give you so much, you know?
You're speaking to another space, continuous learning, life learning. And I think it's something as we as society, but really, especially in the utility space, it isn't one and done. No matter what degree or what level or how many years, being in that training, developing the training, being the student and vice, it's like a whole process and it's never ending. And I do think we have created these very, maybe it's like our schooling system, right? You go first grade, second grade, graduate, collegiate, tech training, done. But really, it's an ever evolving space of learning. And so how do we bring that culture back into the utilities?
You got to build it into your plan. Not, I would expect the guys to spend an hour a day training, right? Coming to work, log in, do emails, check tickets. And if there's no priority tickets, then go to the training website and spend an hour there, or go to a lab and work in a lab for an hour. Every day I would expect that. And I would support it. But oftentimes they're so embedded into today activities like, I got to get this ticket done. I'm metrics on this. I got to do this. And training always falls by the wayside, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's kind of one of my reasons why I'm doing this podcast is, and I think, and just to shout out to AIC, we did kick off a new workforce development committee, because I think in every conversation I have gotten to sit in the last, 18 months being a part of the AIC larger, it comes down to the leaders speaking to how do we prepare and train the next workforce. And it's almost like a reset, like a refresh needs to happen, let's refocus, because a lot of our expertise and talent, we've been saying it for, I think, 15 years now, are on the verge of retirement. So how are we containing that information and, bestowing it upon? But it's really not even that. I mean, even those that are like exiting are learning rapidly, is what it sounds like, right? Like at the end of the career, are learning whole new systems while trying to teach old systems and vice versa. So,
Yeah. I have a
exciting space to be in if you're in the right culture.
It
Yeah.
is. It is,
Yeah.
and the culture. It's funny you say that because the culture that I've been driving towards on in my organization is I call it own capital IT, own it. Right? You're responsible for your career. You're responsible for your environment. We're going to give you the tools, right? And if you need more, then tell me. But I really want the people to start taking that interest in that self development and that continuous education because that's the only way we're going to stay with it. Because there's going to be a point where this breakover of technology that there will no longer be the TDM legacy stuff out there. If it is, it'll be so remote that you'll likely never see it. But
You have
there is
your
going to be that breakover, right? And what's that look like? And I don't want this to be culture shock. I want these guys to kind of, boil the frog, if you will, right? All of a sudden now they wake up one day and they're this IP spin, if you will, or this new technology spin.
right, like not being replaced or just like being
No,
transitioning and being phased, and then one day you're yeah. Well, hopefully with the frog analogy, you're like being boiled. So let's
that's a
maybe,
pretty strong analogy, but
but I know what you mean in a good way. So I love this conversation. I think, one thing I'm going to do is really continue to bring on the telecom expertise because I think the external stakeholders, the regulators, our leaders, wherever they may sit, that AKA have the levers to make powerful moves. I think we're still trying to figure out who that might be. So if you had, you're sitting in front of them, and you have 1 minute, or maybe you're sitting in front of a crew of your next technicians, what's the message that you would share from your journey being in this industry at this moment in time?
I said it earlier, and it just stay curious. Be curious in the technology. Put yourself in a position to, you know, recognize you're going to make mistakes, but it's a safe place to make mistakes. Own those mistakes and share that and learn or teach others from that so they can learn from it and learn from other people's mistakes. But really be in the game because in our world, right, and especially in the telecom side, a lot of them are field folks. They're out driving through dusty roads or up mountaintops or in the snow or whatever. And there's a safety aspect too. So they've got to be in the game from a safety perspective. They got to be in the game from a technology perspective. And they got to be willing to say, I don't know. They got to be willing to reach across the aisle and say, help me. But you got to have a culture that does that. Because if culture doesn't work that, no matter what you tell your team, they're going to clam up and then you're going to constantly live through surprises, which is, our world is never a good thing.
Love it. Well, thank you, Aaron. And thanks. I know that you and I have been playing podcasts. I don't know, what's it called? Phone tag. So I love we stuck with it and we had this conversation. And I look forward to continue to hear about, you building your team and how the telecom space is happening in Arizona and the industry as a whole. So
appreciate your time. Thank you for allowing this, setting this up. I appreciate it.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the GridMod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.